All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jess Nessery. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and also by Springer Publishing. This week's speaker is Alexandra Siegel from the University of Colorado at Boulder, giving a talk entitled Can Exposure to Celebrities Reduce Prejudice? The Effect of Mo Salah on Islamophobic Behaviors and Attitudes. Alex's talk is going to last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And you can ask a question at any time during the talk, but I'm going to hold those questions until the end of the presentation. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud during the Q&A period. A link to Alex's paper and slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Alex Siegel to the IMC. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Justin. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone tuning in on this Friday. As Justin mentioned, this presentation in this paper is entitled Can Exposure to Celebrities Reduce Prejudice? The Effect of Mo Salah on Islamophobic Behaviors and Attitudes. And this is joint work with Salah, Will Marble, and Salma Musa. And just a plug here quickly, Will is on the job market and has been publishing up a storm lately, so you all should check out his fantastic work. So to start this off, for those of you who might not be soccer fans, who is Mo Salah? So he is an Egyptian soccer player, and he, over the past few years, has been extremely successful. He was the top scorer in the Premier League twice, the best player in the Premier League in 2017 and 2018. He won the Champions League final with Liverpool in 2018-2019 and led Egypt to the 2018 World Cup. So he's been very successful in the soccer world. And in terms of the motivation for this paper, why should we care about Mo Salah? So my co-authors and I got excited about this topic when we observed British soccer fans, Liverpool fans in the stadium participating in popular chants like these. If he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too. If he's good enough for you, he's good enough for me. Sitting in a mosque, that's where I want to be. So you can imagine it's pretty unusual to see a bunch of mostly white, mostly male British soccer fans participating in a chant like this. And this was by no means the only one. There were other similar chants that became popular among Liverpool fans, like Mohamed Salah, sent by Allah, he's always scoring, it's almost boring, please don't take Mohammed away, right? So you have all of these chants that are kind of invoking his Muslim identity as a positive thing in the context of a soccer stadium by, again, these mostly white, male, often older British soccer fans who we wouldn't expect to have particularly positive perceptions of Islam. So upon observing this prompted us to be interested in this idea of a Salah effect on Islamophobia. And this was something that got a fair amount of media attention around 2018 as well. There was speculation that Salah could be reducing prejudice among Liverpool fans. And so you started to see newspaper headlines like Mo Salah of Liverpool breaks down cultural barriers one goal at a time, or Liverpool Football Club, Mohamed Salah, an Arab Muslim sports star, subtly confronting racism and Islamophobia. Footballer Mo Salah is tackling Islamophobia head on, right? So in the vein of the coverage this was getting and what we observed ourselves, we were interested in exploring this Salah effect more systematically. So in particular, in this paper, we ask, can exposure to outgroup celebrities, particularly celebrities who are members of underrepresented minority groups, reduce prejudice? And in this case, has exposure to Mohamed Salah reduced Islamophobic behaviors and attitudes, particularly among Liverpool fans? So to give a little bit of more theoretical social science motivation to this question. So decades of social science literature, including in social psychology and political science, have highlighted that contact with members of an outgroup can reduce prejudice when certain conditions are met. And there's a great deal of both observational and lab experiment style evidence, and more recently, more naturalistic field experiments supporting this. But in the real world, there are limited opportunities for this face-to-face contact with members of especially underrepresented minority outgroups. And so this has prompted what's known as the parasocial contact hypothesis, which we are testing here in this paper. So the idea behind the parasocial contact hypothesis is that mediated contact with members of minority groups has the potential to reduce prejudice towards that group in a similar way to interpersonal contact. And so this typically includes relationships formed either through the media or through being an audience member in a stadium with celebrities, including reporters, athletes, reality show stars, and even fictional characters. And it's this exposure usually through the mass media or through coming into contact with this celebrity at the distance as a fan. So parasocial contact is thought to lower barriers to face-to-face interpersonal contact. And typically, the reason why people don't often come face-to-face or have the opportunity for interpersonal contact with outgroup members is first that there are psychological barriers such as intergroup anxiety. There are social barriers, communities might be segregated and people might not interact with each other day to day. Again, logistical barriers that might be tied to segregation or the living patterns in particular communities. So under what conditions, given that there are all these barriers to face-to-face contact, might parasocial contact reduce prejudice? The literature gives us a few clues. So first, the exposure is thought to need to be positive in order to reduce prejudice, sustained, although exactly how much contact is necessary or the exact dosage is still an open question in the literature. And what's very important is exposure to the celebrity figure has to include a clear signal of their outgroup membership. It needs to be clear that that person is a member of the outgroup community in order for exposure to that one celebrity or individual to generalize to a reduction in prejudice towards the outgroup more broadly. So Salah seems like an ideal case of this, especially in the time period we were conducting this study in 2018, 2019, in that people were having very positive exposure to him as he was a highly successful soccer player. And they see him throughout the season. So there's a fair amount of sustained exposure. And his outgroup membership is quite clearly signaled. So in his case, he regularly prays on the field. He discusses things like fasting during Ramadan and other facets of his Muslim identity. His wife wears a hijab and frequently shows up at matches. His daughter is named after the holy city of Mecca. So there's quite a few opportunities for fans to kind of be aware of his outgroup membership. And this includes, for example, the fact that in the FIFA soccer game, the fact that he prays on the field after he scores goals is so well known that in the FIFA video game, his avatar actually prays on the field as well after scoring. So his identity is quite salient in the way that we think is an important condition for the parasocial contact to reduce prejudice. So what do we do in order to test this? So what methods are we applying here? So we use 3 complementary analyses to test the Salah effect. The first is an analysis of administrative data of hate crimes in the UK. The second is an analysis of anti-Muslim tweets by UK soccer fans. And the third is an original Facebook survey experiment of Liverpool fans in the UK. So to start out with our hate crimes analysis, we submitted Freedom of Information requests to all UK police jurisdictions to get hate crime data, and we requested monthly hate crime data from January 2015 to April 2018, the period surrounding when Salah joins Liverpool with time before and after. And we were able to get usable data from 25 out of 39 jurisdictions. So this gives us 936 month country observations. So our goal with this data is to predict what the hate crime rate would have been in Merseyside County, which is the county where Liverpool is located, had Salah not joined Liverpool, and then compare it to what we actually observe in practice. So we want to generate a counterfactual estimate of what would have happened if Salah did not join Liverpool. And so we do this with a synthetic control approach or a matrix completion method. Specifically, we're using the GSynth package in R to do this. And the goal here is that we're trying to find a combination of control units that match pre-treatment trends in Merseyside in order to be able to generate this counterfactual prediction. And so we can again then use this combination to be able to have a predicted measure of this unobserved counterfactual and compare that counterfactual to what we actually observed in the post-treatment period. In this case, we compare the actual hate crime rate to the predicted hate crime rate to get our treatment estimate. So what does this look like when we use this synthetic control approach? So the white shaded area is our pre-treatment period, and the gray shaded area is our post-treatment period after Salah joins Liverpool. And what we observe is we see on average a 16% lower hate crime rate relative to the counterfactual synthetic control relative to what we would have expected to see if Salah had not joined Liverpool. But hate crimes, of course, are a really extreme form of prejudicial behavior, and they're fairly rare overall. So we wanted to look at reductions in prejudicial behavior in a second way as well. And so to do this, we turn to looking at anti-Muslim tweets. More specifically, what we do is we scrape the timelines of UK-based followers of several major football clubs, including Liverpool. So we have Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester United, and we also included Everton, which is another football club that's also located in the same county as Liverpool in Merseyside County. And we made sure that these were people who had been following these teams for a long time, that they were older followers of the clubs. And the way to do this is because followers on Twitter are stored chronologically. You can select earlier followers and be fairly confident that for these popular accounts that have been around for almost 10 years at this point, that the older followers were following these accounts before Salah joined Liverpool. And so this generated a collection of about 15 million tweets. And then the next step was to say, okay, first, can we identify tweets that are about Muslims in general in these tweets from soccer fans, and then classify them as anti-Muslim or not. So the way in which we did this, in order to first identify tweets about Muslims, we used a dictionary-based approach. And so we began with just the terms Muslim and Islam, and then used a word embeddings approach, used word2vec in order to find other similar terms, including hashtags and slang that were used in our Twitter data to describe Muslims, to build out a larger dictionary of terms related to Muslims in the tweets. So using this dictionary, we identified 44,000 tweets that were about Muslims, and then trained human coders and used a naive Bayes classifier, a supervised classification approach, in order to determine whether the tweets about Muslims were expressing positive or negative sentiment towards Muslims. And so once we have these relative measures over time of the proportion of tweets containing anti-Muslim rhetoric, we can again use a similar matrix completion method in order to impute our counterfactual in the post-treatment period and compare that to what we actually observe to measure our Salah effect. So what we find in the Twitter data is, on average, relative to the synthetic control, we see a 48% lower proportion of anti-Muslim tweets. But as you can see from this figure here, the difference between the observed and imputed values seems to taper off after a few months. And our hate crimes data actually only went until about this point. We had Twitter data for a longer period of time. So this could be suggestive evidence telling you something about how long this treatment effect might last and how long we might expect these to last more generally. So we have this observational data, which seems to show us some behavioral evidence of an effect of Salah on reducing Islamophobic behavior in the form of both hate crimes and tweets. But we wanted to understand more specifically in what way does exposure to Salah and positive feelings towards Salah generalize towards feelings towards Muslims as a whole. And so in order to kind of test out the mechanisms here and understand what might be driving the effects that we observe in our observational data, we conduct a survey experiment. And so in particular, what we're trying to get out of this again is how does exposure to Salah, this one celebrity figure, lead to a generalized reduction in Islamophobia or prejudice? So to get at this, we advertised a survey over Facebook targeting Liverpool fans, namely people who like the Liverpool soccer club page and live in the UK. We got over 8,000 respondents. People on Facebook were very eager to tell us what they thought about soccer, which is kind of in contrast to what we often see when we want to ask people about politics through Facebook experiments. Our median respondent was 54 years old, high school educated, and white, which is probably a little bit older, but maybe what you might expect of the Liverpool fan base. And also just to note that this is a population that might be fairly hard to move in terms of their prejudicial attitudes and behaviors. So we assigned respondents primarily to either a pure control group or a treatment group, which is priming Salah's Muslim identity, the fact that he's a religious Muslim. And the reason we did this is because one of the most important preconditions for exposure to a celebrity to generalize towards attitudes towards a group writ large or as a whole is that the identity of that individual, their outgroup identity, has to be salient. So in particular, we presented people in the treatment group with a prime, which shows Salah crying on the field. And the prime says, in addition to his goal scoring, Salah is known for an attachment to his Muslim identity, both on and off the pitch. After every goal he scores, Salah touches his head to the ground in prayer. He also fasts during Ramadan, except on match days, and shares well wishes with his followers on social media during Islamic holidays. He named his daughter Mecca after Islam's holiest site, right? So this is designed to remind people how salient his identity is. And these fans may know this already since they're fans of the team and likely fans of Salah as well. But this is to say, if we make people concentrate on the salience of his identity, what does this do to their self-reported attitudes? So we asked people a bunch of outcome survey questions designed to capture this. So the first is thinking about religion and society. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view? Islam is generally compatible with the values of British society, or there is a fundamental clash between Islam and the values of British society, right? So we're trying to get a sense of people's self-reported perceptions of how compatible Islam is with British society. We also asked people, in your opinion, do immigrants generally have a positive or negative impact on the United Kingdom? Because there's a possibility that even though Salah's identity that's most salient is his Muslim identity, that this might translate towards immigrant identity more broadly. And then we also asked people, how much do you think you have in common with Muslims in the UK, as another way of sort of capturing self-reported Islamophobia or attitudes towards Muslims. We also include an index of all three outcomes of principal component analysis. So what do we find here? So basically what we find is that people who were exposed to this treatment, to this prime highlighting Salah's salient identity, were more likely to express positive feelings towards Muslims, in particular, that Islam was compatible with British values. It seems like that part of the measure is really what's driving the significant effect in the principal component outcome. We see something in the same direction for feeling something in common with Muslims, but it's not statistically significant, and no effect for the impact of immigrants, which perhaps is a little far afield from us priming Muslim identity specifically. So to discuss kind of what we found and how we interpret these results. So first, just to summarize, we see about 16% fewer hate crimes and 48% fewer anti-Muslim tweets relative to synthetic controls, or relative to these counterfactual estimates of what we should expect to see if Salah had not joined Liverpool. And we think our survey experiment highlights the importance of salient outgroup identity for the parasocial contact hypothesis to work, for this contact with Salah, this positive perception to generalize to the outgroup as a whole. What else might explain these findings though? So one thing that we looked at is perhaps the fan base is just happier because Liverpool is winning a lot in this period. So perhaps our reduction in hate crimes and our reduction in Islamophobic tweets is really just a function of the fact that people are happier in general. And so one way to look at this is to say, okay, if people are just happier, perhaps we should expect to see fewer crimes all around, not just the hate crimes. So we again turn to the crime data that we have from the UK, and we see that there is no effect of Salah joining Liverpool on other criminal activity the way there is on hate crimes. Another thing that we were curious about is what about other Muslim players? Is this something that's unique to Mohammed Salah, or is this something that we should see with other Muslim players as well? And so in order to look at this, we also examined the effect of Sadio Mane, another Muslim player who joined Liverpool, on both the Islamophobic tweets and the hate crimes. And what we see when we look at the Mane data is we don't see a reduction in hate crimes, but we do see a small reduction in Islamophobic tweets. And what we think is going on here is that Mane is sort of a much less well-known player, first of all, and his Muslim identity is a lot less salient. So he is Senegalese and he's Black, and so that part of his identity may be more salient than his Muslim identity, and he's not particularly known for talking about his Muslim identity or Islam on or off the pitch. We also see that he gets a lot less coverage in the Liverpool Echo, the newspaper, which gives a lot of coverage to the soccer team, and so it's possible that he's, just because he's less well-known and his identity is less salient, that makes us less likely to observe these strong effects, but we still see a smaller effect in the Twitter data, which includes probably ardent fans who are following the club on Twitter. So when we look at the Mane effect, we do see something like the Salah effect on Twitter, but again, not on hate crimes. And we think this is because he is a less well-known player and his Muslim identity is less salient. So what does this contribute overall? So we think that our work is building on this parasocial contact literature by first providing naturalistic evidence. Most of the existing studies in this space are either lab experiments with fictional characters or observational studies where there is not a identification strategy that allows you to get any kind of causal purchase on this question. So here we're providing experimental evidence beyond this kind of lab setting, and we have behavioral outcomes, right? Our survey experiment is looking at attitudes, but our analysis of hate crime data and Twitter data lets us look at actual real world behavioral measures of prejudice. So what does this tell us more broadly? When should we expect parasocial contact to reduce prejudice beyond just the Salah effect? So we think first, as our survey experiment demonstrates, that linking the public figure to the outgroup, the salience of their identity, is quite important. But also the exposure has to be positive. And from what we see anecdotally, apolitical behavior on the part of the celebrity figure also makes this more likely. When celebrities take clear stances on political issues, this is often taken up by the mainstream media in such a way to sort of incite partisan or other kinds of political divisions. But of course, celebrities speaking out on political issues, especially members of outgroups, underrepresented minority figures speaking up about prejudice that they face day to day or structural racism in their societies, is also an important platform to give a public face to those issues. So there's a little bit of a tension here in that the exposure being positive and apolitical may be the reason we see the Salah effect generalizing to a reduction in prejudice overall, but that's not to say normatively that it's a negative thing for celebrities to speak up on important polarizing issues. We also think that a key condition here is that the contact is providing new information about a relatively unknown outgroup. So in this case, Salah is providing a different perspective and new information on Islam than UK soccer fans might normally have access to based on things like portrayal of Muslims in the media. And we think more generally that this is a starting point and that a lot more research is needed on these effects of underrepresented minority celebrities on prejudicial attitudes and behaviors in other contexts to better understand the conditions under which parasocial contact might be successful in reducing prejudice. And so along these lines, we have future work that we'd love to get your thoughts and feedback on as well, but we think that important aspects of this that our study doesn't cover explicitly that we need more research on is first the effect of media portrayals. How does the way that the media portrays these celebrity figures contribute to the degree to which we might see positive parasocial contact? Also, what is the role of success? So Salah was extremely successful in the period under study, but there's anecdotal evidence that support for these players from underrepresented minority outgroups is tied to their success on the field. So here's a quote, for example, from another player in Germany who says, "I'm a German when I win and an immigrant when we lose," right? And a similar sentiment, when things go well, they're calling me the Belgian striker. When things aren't going well, the Belgian striker of Congolese descent, right? And so in this case, there's the idea that people will only be portrayed in this positive light when they are successful on the field. Although what's interesting about the Salah case, which is sort of in contrast to these quotes by other players, is for Salah, the chants from the fans are all about kind of praising his Muslim identity, saying, if he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too, as opposed to these quotes, which are more highlighting kind of integration when the team is successful and othering when the team is unsuccessful. So this is another aspect of parasocial contact that we are hoping to explore in future work. And then the other part of this that we're very interested in that I mentioned earlier is the effect of taking political stances. So we saw in the US context, most recently, Colin Kaepernick's experience with having an extremely negative reaction from the media, particularly when he took a stance on racial issues in the US. And so there is, on the one hand, right, this potentially controversial reaction to celebrities taking stances, but on the other hand, this offers them a platform to raise awareness and promote opportunities for perspective taking. So this is another aspect of this dynamic that we're hoping to study in future work. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Alex, for that presentation. At this point, Alex Siegel is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question during the Q&A period. And we have quite a few questions that have already come in, so I'm just going to get started. Sumitra Badranathan asks, curious to know if these positive effects backfire for those who staunchly do not support Liverpool.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question, and it's something that we're not able to get at with our hate crime data, but we can see in the Twitter data. So one of the things we look for is, do we see backlash from fans of other teams, the other kind of top football clubs, but also Everton, which is in the same county, but a rival team. And we do not see evidence of backlash in the Twitter data. I will say, though, it's important to note that anti-Muslim tweets overall are fairly rare among soccer fans. It's not like they're spending all day tweeting about Muslims in general. So there are limitations to this in terms of answering the question. But from what we see in the data we have, there's not evidence of backlash here.
An anonymous attendee asked, are we confident that the change in hate crime and anti-Muslim tweets are caused by the treatment? I am wondering if there could be other events that may drive the change.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and so there's a few things that we try to do to ascertain this. So first, in addition to our kind of synthetic control approach, we also replicate this with a two-way fixed effect dip and dip approach, and include placebo dates to try to ascertain, how big is this change relative to what we would see if we selected placebo dates at random, and our results seem to hold that way. I also think it seems unlikely that there would be events that should drive a shift in Liverpool fans' behaviors or in people residing in Merseyside County, but not in other parts of the UK in the period that we're studying. And one more thing that we did to try to get at this is one of the reasons with the Twitter data, we didn't just look at the volume of anti-Muslim tweets overall, but we looked at them relative to tweets about Muslims more generally, was to try to make sure that this wasn't driven by just shifting salience of Muslims for some other reason unrelated to what we were examining.
Samantha Magic asks, excuse me, to what extent is gender relevant to Salah's impact on fans' perceptions of Muslims and hate crimes? For example, were your survey respondents predominantly male? I'm thinking here how your study may be applied to other cases, for example, Megan Rapinoe, and how it shapes perception of gender and LGBTQ equality.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. So our sample did skew male, but I believe when we looked at heterogeneous effects by gender, we didn't see clear differences there. But I think your question more generally, and one of the things that we're looking into with extensions of this project, is in what other circumstances might this apply? And so your example of Megan Rapinoe would be a great other case to look at to try to get a sense of how generalizable this phenomenon is.
Samantha also suggested you check out the March 2020 issue of Perspectives on Politics, which focuses on celebrity and politics, and there's a link there which I can send you after the talk. Chris Zorn, one of our advisory board members, and I happen to know a Tottenham Hotspur fan, asks, the success point seems really critical. Much of the recent racial and immigrant abuse of PL players seems to occur following losses or underperformances. You sort of mentioned this in your talk. Would it be possible to conduct a similar analysis focusing on a high-profile Muslim player whose success has been more moderate, like Paul Pogba or Mesut Ozil?
Yeah, this is a great question. And one of the things we tried to do, even in this study, was to try to see if we could get at success at all, even just looking at, how successful Liverpool was across this period with the Twitter data, where we have this real-time data. And also in the survey experiment, we tried to prime people by saying either Mo Salah is really successful or Mo Salah is no longer successful. But the problem was in this period, he was too successful. And so that wasn't really a compelling frame here. But I think your question is spot on. And that's something that we would really like to do in future extensions of this, or even now that Liverpool is doing less well now, to just do this over a longer time horizon so we get to a less successful period to be able to evaluate that.
I mean, I kind of had a similar question about ethnicity as a moderator of response. So it might be the case that you get hacked off at all the players when they're not doing well, but you get really hacked off at the Muslims. And when they're doing well, you like all the players, but maybe you like the Muslims more, or maybe you like them less. I'm not sure. Is there any way of getting at that in the data you already have?
Yeah, so I don't think we have a great way to get at that with our current data, but one follow-up to this that we are in the process of setting up for is looking at the kind of fantasy football spaces where people are trading players, like individual players, so we can try to get a sense of whether people punish certain types of players more for team losses than others, and that sort of thing, to try to get more at sort of what are people doing behaviorally on the individual player level across lots of teams.
It's kind of interesting. I don't do much fantasy football, but my interaction with it is primarily the same way one might interact with a spreadsheet. So it's it would be deeply irrational to trade someone because you didn't like their ethnicity or whatever.
Yeah.
So Matthew Simonson asks, first of all, hi, great presentation. I recently read that when Joe Louis, a great African-American boxer, lost a big match, it provoked anti-black violence, even though he had been highly popular among whites previously. Should we be worried that a prominent Muslim losing soccer matches could have as big a negative effect as a positive effect of him winning? So you see the same question kind of coming up over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you all are spot on, right? That the success failure dimension is going to be kind of a crucial next step to get a better sense of how this might generalize more broadly. And then the other question that we have as well is, does it matter that there's relatively kind of less known about Muslims and Islam in the UK context, say, relative to race relations in the US, where most people have kind of stronger preconceived notions and opinions.
Just following up on this a little bit, this wouldn't be a problem for your Twitter data, but for the hate crimes data, this is going to reflect my ignorance of English football. But to what extent is fandom linked to geography, right? So does everyone in Liverpool love Liverpool and hate everyone else? Or is it more like, people in Liverpool cheer for Arsenal or cheer for whoever? Because that could really affect your the implications of your analysis.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, it's not perfect, right? Like, it's possible that there are fans in other places,
Sure.
but it's definitely the majority splits enough in this geographic way, except for this case I was talking about, that there's another smaller team, Everton, which is also in Merseyside County, where Liverpool is. And so that's what we wanted to look at them in particular in the Twitter data too, to see, did we see backlash from those people that are in the same county?
I mean, you hear tales in the U.S. of some fan of another team going to a Philadelphia Eagles game in Philadelphia and, getting pelted with batteries or something. So, that's
Right.
that's sort of the extreme. But yeah. Okay, so Evan Roberts asked, can you speak about the choice to send the test ads on Facebook and analyze sentiment on a different platform, Twitter? Is there overlap in the following of Liverpool on the two platforms?
Oh yeah, so this is a good question. The main reason to conduct the survey experiment on Facebook is just that it's a lot easier to do this kind of ad targeting of getting people's locations and the fact that they're Liverpool fans, that they like these popular Liverpool pages. You can do this on Twitter too, but fewer people are on Twitter. So I would say probably the fans on Twitter might be more ardent fans than the fans on Facebook, or at least a more kind of demographically limited subset. So I think that the survey experiment probably gets us a broader collection of a representation of Liverpool fans than the Twitter data, but the Twitter data is just the publicly available data where we can see what fans are saying, whereas that would be private on Facebook. I think in an ideal world, we would have done all the social media stuff on Facebook, but we just aren't able to see individual fans' day-to-day posts there.
For the hate crimes analysis, I'm curious. I'm not sure you consider this a placebo treatment or not, but did you look at the effect on not hate crimes but just regular crimes? Because I think there are two possibilities. One of which is it's an artifact, but another possibility is there are just as many crimes. It's just that there's this enhancement, right? There's this hate element of it that goes away because of Salah.
Yeah, so we looked at other crimes partly just to see, was this just an effect of fans being happier when he was winning rather than anything to do with prejudice or hate crimes? And we don't see a similar effect on other types of crime, both violent crime and things like property crime, theft, and that sort of thing.
And hate crimes are inside of that's a subset of violent crimes, right?
Yeah, so it's a subset of violent crimes.
Which that suggests that if there are just as many crimes, what happens is not that crime goes down, but that crimes that would have been hate crimes are just instead regular crimes. Right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So right. So we don't see some kind of generalized reduction in crime. Yeah.
It's just that they're not going to shout racist things at you while they steal your purse or whatever.
Right.
um, Lena Song asks, first of all, great talk. For the survey experiment component, did you try to run this on a sample not fans that are similar in demographics? That would help address and separate out potential experiment or demand effect.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. We only ran the Facebook experiment at the time mostly because we were funding constrained. But in future work where we want to kind of tease out some of the things we didn't get to and just expand on the research, I think that's a great idea. And you would want to know sort of what are the effects in the population more broadly, not just among fans.
Do you think there was an experiment or demand effect here? Like they knew what you were looking for?
So I don't really think so, in the sense that ratings of Muslims and Islam in our survey are still like pretty comparable to what you see in general survey data from the UK. And it's just that we see this difference between our treatment and control group. But I guess you mean if there was demand from the treated people when they
right, like when you show them the Salah picture.
Yeah, I can see that. I think we can't rule out that possibility.
Right. So maybe if you were doing this with Arsenal fans and you saw the same effect, that would sort of indicate, oh, this is experiment or demand.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. That's definitely something that would be good to look at.
So Samantha Magic asked again, it's great to see more research on the effects of celebrity. I'd like to hear more about your methods, specifically, one, how do you verify that the tweets you are studying aren't bots? Second, can you say more what you mean and how you operationalized a synthetic control?
Sure. So in terms of the Twitter data, you're right, this is always something that we might be concerned about. I did a couple of things to try to look at this. First, this is definitely imperfect, but just running the tweets through Botometer, which is one of these, it's a machine learning algorithm that tries to detect bots based on a lot of common bot features, and it definitely doesn't work perfectly, but you want to see that on average, you don't seem to have a lot more accounts flagged as inauthentic than you normally see in Twitter data. Also, just these older fans, because these are earlier followers of the teams, bot and troll activity were a lot less common in, say, 2010, 2011, when many of these people initially followed the soccer fan team accounts. But I mean, you're right that it's obviously a possibility that some of this is tied to inauthentic activity, although we shouldn't expect to see more of it among Liverpool fans than fans of other teams. And I guess that actually brings me to how the synthetic control approach works. So the basic idea behind this is that you're trying to impute these unobserved outcomes in the post-treatment period by looking for structure in the pre-treatment or control period that generates good predictions of the counterfactual. So in the case of the hate crime data, these are comparing other counties to Merseyside County, where Liverpool is located. And in the case of the Twitter data, it's comparing Liverpool fans to fans of other teams. So we're using this structure in the pre-treatment control data, so the data generated either by non-Liverpool teams or non-Merseyside counties, to generate these counterfactual predictions.
Matthew Simpson asked, Beitar Jerusalem, the only Israeli Premier League team to never sign an Arab player, was recently bought in part by a member of the Emirati royal family. If they start signing Arab Israeli players and are thus seen as being quote-unquote forcibly integrated, what should we expect? Initial backlash but long-term positive impact, or what?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic case, actually. I think that we would probably love to start looking at to actually see what we observe. I think I wonder even what the backlash is to the team being bought, right? Let alone let alone bringing on Arab players. So I think again, in a way, our paper kind of generates more questions about this than it answers, and kind of is prompting this as a research agenda. But I think that's a fantastic case that we would love to look at.
I mean, it also strikes me that in that case, there are going to be few countries in the world where Muslim or Arab identity is more salient and more it provokes stronger emotions than Israel. I mean, Britain obviously has issues, but I venture to say they're not as significant as the ones Israel's facing. So I kind of wonder if, in that context, it's just not as important because, the people's opinions are fixed anyway. Or maybe it's even more important, right? Maybe it even has a bigger effect.
Right. And I also think having done a little bit of work in the Israeli context on prejudice more generally, it's a space where, especially in the online sphere, there's a lot more prevalence of really public anti-Arab sentiment and hate speech at baseline. So, I think the other thing that this context raises is, what do these things look like in context of long-standing intractable intergroup conflict compared to places where there are issues with structural racism and a lot of social tensions, but there's not ongoing violent conflict in the area.
It's also the case that the Jewish majority in Israel is also a minority and a persecuted minority in many other places throughout the world, whereas the Brits would have a hard time, I think, making the claim that they're a persecuted minority. So the dynamic of, in some kind of weird sense, two minority groups in conflict might be different than a majority group and a minority group.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, most of the work that's been done so far on parasocial contact in general is talking about sort of underrepresented minority figures in a society. So I think you're right. The size of the minority group, the conditions of conflict, all these sorts of contextual features almost certainly would color how this plays out in other contexts.
Right, and you could make you mentioned in the American context, you could maybe do a similar study with Black Americans versus white Americans, but there's a lot more history going on there than there might be, in comparing to Great Britain and Muslims. Well, okay, we're out of questions, and we're actually doing great on time, so I'm going to thank Alex for being our presenter today. I want to remind everyone that this broadcast will be recorded and posted on YouTube, so you can share it with a colleague or watch it again later. It's also posted to our website, www.methods-colloquium.com. I also want to invite everyone to join us next week on April 23rd, when we will host a talk by Oliver Rittman of the University of Mannheim. The talk is entitled Video as Data Methods for Political Science Research. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Alex, thanks very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And I hope to see everyone next week.